They thought firing me at 9:30 in the morning was the end. To me, it was just a quiet click, like flipping a switch in a dark room and realizing I was the one who wired the entire building. They cut my plastic access badge, but they forgot I wrote the code for the reader. Come 4 in the afternoon. My performance review turned into a digital trial where the logs did all the talking. My name is Allison Coleman. I am a data operations engineer at Northbridge Meridian Systems in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I am the ghost in the machine. If you walked past my cubicle on the 4th floor, you would see a woman in her mid-30s with sensible glasses and a cardigan that is slightly too warm for the humid southern climate, staring at 3 monitors filled with cascading lines of code. You would likely assume I was doing something administrative, or perhaps answering support tickets. You would be wrong. I was holding up the ceiling. Northbridge Meridian Systems likes to sell itself as a leader in logistical software solutions. They use words like synergy and cloud native in their brochures. The reality is that the entire company runs on a terrifyingly fragile backend that was cobbled together 6 years ago by a team of freelancers who have long since fled to the West Coast. I am the one who stayed. I am the one who memorized the spaghetti code. I am the one who knows that if you run the vendor payment trigger before the payroll batch on a Thursday, the entire SQL database locks up and deletes the accounts receivable table. I fix things. That is my job description. Even if the official title on my contract says something much more modest, I manage the dashboards that the VP of Sales uses to brag about his quarterly bonuses. I maintain the payroll bridges that ensure 3,000 employees get their direct deposits. I handle the vendor triggers, the access rights, and the KPI reports. I am the plumber who keeps the sewage from backing up into the boardroom, but like most plumbers, nobody wants to look at me until the toilet overflows. The invisibility was a feature, not a bug. For a long time, I convinced myself that being essential was better than being famous. I told myself that job security lay in the fact that I was the only person who knew how to manually restart the legacy server when it overheated. I was wrong. The theft of my identity did not happen all at once. It happened in slow, agonizing increments, usually starting at 9 in the morning on Mondays. The weekly stand-up meeting was a ritual of humiliation that I had learned to endure with a stoic face. We would gather in the glass-walled conference room, the one with the view of the Charlotte skyline that was mostly obscured by the construction of another bank tower. The air conditioning was always set to a temperature that felt designed to preserve meat. My manager would breeze in, holding a cup of coffee that cost more than my hourly rate when I first started here. He would clap his hands together and say, "Good job. Team, great hustle this week." Then he would pull up a slide. It was always a slide I had sent him the night before. It contained the efficiency metrics I had calculated, the bug fixes I had implemented, and the optimizations I had proposed. He would read my notes verbatim. He would not say, "Allison found a way to reduce server latency by 40%. He would say, "We found a way to reduce server latency by 40%. I would sit there, clutching my notepad, my knuckles white. The other team members, mostly younger guys who spent their time debating cryptocurrency or trying to automate their jobs out of existence so they could play video games, would nod vacantly. They did not care. They got paid regardless. But I cared. I cared because I had spent my weekend rewriting the query logic so that the latency would drop. I cared because I had canceled dinner plans to monitor the deployment. That was the pattern. I did the work. They took the credit. I sacrificed my life. They told me to smile. I remember the day I missed my mother's 60th birthday party. It was a milestone event. My sister had flown in from Oregon. They had rented a venue. I was supposed to give a toast, but at 4 in the afternoon on that Friday, the primary database threw a critical error. The replication lag was spiking, and data was bleeding out of the synchronization loop. If I left, the Monday morning reports would be blank. The stock price would take a hit, so I stayed. I ordered bad Thai food and sat in the dark office, watching the progress bars crawl across my screen while my phone buzzed with texts from my family. I fixed it. I saved the quarter. On Monday. I expected a thank you. I expected a bonus. I expected someone to acknowledge that I had bled for the company. Instead, During my one-on-one review later that week, my manager looked at me with a concerned expression. He told me that some people found me difficult to approach. He said I seemed stressed. He told me, verbatim, "Allison, you should really try to smile more. It is important for the culture here." I did not smile. I went back to my desk and stared at the blinking cursor. That was the moment the loyalty died. It did not die with a scream. It died with a quiet resolve. I stopped volunteering for extra projects. I stopped answering emails after 5 in the afternoon, and I started watching. I am a creature of patterns. My entire career is built on recognizing when a pattern breaks. A server load that spikes 5% higher than usual. A login attempt from an unknown IP address. These are the things that wake me up at night. 2 months ago, I noticed the first anomaly. I have a custom script running on the back end. It is a simple thing, really. It just logs access to the core schema definitions. Most people do not look at the schema. They look at the data. They want to know how many widgets we sold, not how the table relating widgets to vendors is constructed. But someone was looking at the structure. The logs showed the access time as 2:13 in the morning. It was consistent, every night for a week, at exactly 2:13 in the morning. A user account with high-level privileges would log in and query the system architecture. They were not changing anything. They were not deleting anything. They were downloading the blueprints. It was like watching someone dissect a frog. They were taking it apart, piece by piece, layer by layer. They were mapping the dependencies. They were looking at the stored procedures I had written 5 years ago. They were analyzing the triggers I had set up to handle the messy data from our legacy acquisitions. At first, I thought it was an external breach. I went into hunter mode. I traced the IP address. It was internal. It was coming from the VPN concentrator, using a secure token. It was one of us. I dug deeper. The queries were too specific to be random. They were targeting the exact areas where my knowledge was unique. They were downloading the documentation I had written for the disaster recovery protocols. They were pulling the logic for the proprietary pricing engine that only I knew how to tune. Then came the deck. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks ago. I had been working on a strategic proposal for months. It was a plan to modernize our data warehouse, to move away from the brittle legacy systems and onto a scalable cloud platform. I had poured my soul into it. I had written 40 pages of technical analysis, cost projections, and risk assessments. I had stayed up until midnight finishing the slide deck. I saved it to the shared drive in a folder marked Drafts. I intended to present it to the CTO the following month. I was walking past the main executive boardroom on my way to get coffee when I saw it. The glass walls were not soundproof, but they were transparent enough. Inside, the entire executive leadership team was gathered. My manager was there. So was the VP of Operations. And on the massive 80-inch screen at the head of the table was my slide deck. I stopped cold. My hand tightened around my empty mug. It was my font. It was my color scheme. It was my graph showing the projected cost savings over 3 years. I knew that graph intimately. I had agonized over the axis labels, but something was missing. The title slide came up. Strategic Infrastructure Overhaul. Beneath it, where my name should have been. It said nothing. The author field was blank. The footer, which I had carefully tagged with "Prepared by A. Coleman," had been scrubbed. I watched as a young man I barely recognized stood up to present. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He pointed at my graph. He used my words. He explained my strategy as if it were a brilliant revelation he had just divined from the ether. The executives nodded. They looked impressed. They took notes. I stood there in the hallway, invisible, while they cannibalized my mind. That was when the realization hit me. It was not just about credit anymore. This was not just a bad manager taking a bow for his team. This was systemic. The logs at 2:13 in the morning, the dissection of my code, the downloading of my documentation, the presentation of my strategy without my name. They were not just ignoring me. They were not just underappreciating me. They were copying me. They were extracting everything I knew, everything I did, and everything I was. And they were putting it into a format that did not require Allison Coleman to operate. They were building a clone of my utility so they could discard the original. I walked back to my desk. I did not scream. I did not cry. I sat down and unlocked my workstation. The fans in my tower whirred to life. The screens glowed with the familiar comfort of the command line interface. If they wanted to treat me like a machine, I would show them exactly what happens when a machine malfunctions. They thought they were extracting the operating system. They forgot that I was the one who wrote the source code. I opened a new terminal window. I typed a single command to bring up the hidden logs I kept for my own peace of mind. I needed to know exactly who was running those queries at 2:13 in the morning. I needed to know who was holding the knife. The cursor blinked. The system waited. I was not just an employee anymore. I was a liability they had failed to mitigate. And as I stared at the screen, I realized that for the first time in years, I was not tired. I was wide awake. The game had changed, and they had made the first move without realizing that I controlled the board. If the previous management team was a group of negligent landlords who let the pipes rust, Grant Halverson was the demolition crew that arrived without a permit. He did not walk into the office so much as he was deployed. He was our new vice president of operations, and he looked exactly like the kind of man who practiced his handshake in front of a mirror every morning before checking his stock portfolio. Grant was a walking, breathing LinkedIn profile picture. He had teeth that were aggressively white, a tan that suggested he spent his weekends on a boat he did not actually own, and a suit that fit him a little too perfectly. When he looked at you, he did not see a human being with a skill set and a mortgage. He saw a row on a spreadsheet that could be conditionally formatted to red. He had been with the company for exactly 4 days when the calendar invites started appearing. He called them pulse checks. To anyone else, a pulse check sounds like a quick medical precaution. To those of us on the 4th floor, it was psychological warfare. My Outlook calendar, which used to be a neat block of dedicated coding time, suddenly looked like a crime scene. There were 15-minute syncs at 8 in the morning. There were alignment sessions at 12:30 during lunch. There were wrap-up huddles at 5:15. Grant did not actually care about our pulse. He cared about submission. I sat in the first of these meetings, watching him pace back and forth in front of the whiteboard. He did not use a marker. He just held it, clicking the cap on and off, a rhythmic tick that made my teeth ache. "We are going to streamline," he said, looking directly at a point on the wall just above my head. The word streamline was his favorite weapon. He used it as a noun, a verb, and an adjective. "We need to streamline the workflow. This looks like a streamline opportunity. We need to be more streamlined." It did not matter that the grammar was broken. The intent was clear. Streamline meant cut. Streamline meant cheaper. Streamline meant me. He went around the room, asking each of us to justify our existence in 30 seconds or less. When it was my turn, I started to explain the complexity of the data migration triggers I was monitoring. Grant held up a hand. "Whoa, let us not get into the weeds." "Allison," he said, flashing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just give me the high level. Are we winning or losing? We are maintaining system integrity," I said. "So we are flat," he said. "We need to pivot. We need to be agile." He marked something down in his notebook. I knew right then that he had no idea what I did. And worse, he had no interest in learning. He had already decided that system integrity was just a fancy word for stagnation. But Grant was just the architect. He needed a builder, someone young and hungry and dumb enough to do the dirty work without asking moral questions. He found Logan Pierce. Logan was a former intern who had been hired full-time 6 months ago. He was 23 years old, wore sneakers with his dress slacks, and had the desperate energy of a golden retriever trying to please a master who held a rolled-up newspaper. Under the old regime, Logan was harmless. He fetched coffee, he updated the birthday spreadsheet, and he asked me basic questions about SQL syntax that I answered with patience. Under Grant, Logan was transformed. I found out about his promotion on a Tuesday afternoon. I saw an email announcement go out to the department welcoming Logan into his new role as Strategy Partner Associate. The title was a word salad. It meant nothing, but it sounded expensive. I walked over to Logan's desk to congratulate him, mostly out of habit. He was staring at his monitors, looking terrified. When he saw me coming, he quickly minimized a window. It was a reflex action, the kind a teenager makes when their parent walks in while they are playing video games instead of doing homework. "Hey, congratulations on the bump," I said. "Strategy partner. Sounds serious?" Logan laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Thanks. Allison, yeah, it is cool. Grant has some big ideas." I looked at his screen. He had minimized the window, but he had not closed it. I could see the file name on the taskbar. It was called Q3 Projection Matrix V4. That was my file. I had built that matrix 3 years ago to calculate the variance in our shipping costs. It was a complex beast, full of nested formulas and custom macros that I had written myself. Working on the projections, I asked, keeping my voice even. Logan shifted in his seat. "Yeah, Grant wanted me to, freshen it up, make it pop for the board meeting." I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. "Can I see?" Logan hesitated, then maximized the window. It was my spreadsheet, but it was not my spreadsheet. The columns were the same, the data was the same, but the formatting had been changed to a garish blue and gold theme, and in the header, where it used to say Author A, Coleman, it now read Strategy Lead L, Pierce. I stared at the screen. "You took my name off." "Logan?" He flinched. "It was not me." "Allison, I swear, Grant sent me the template. He said we need a unified voice for the presentation. He said individual credits distract from the brand identity." "Unified voice," I repeated. "Yeah," Logan said, gaining a little confidence from the jargon. "He wants everything to look like it came from the strategy office. He said you would understand. He said he would loop you in later when we get to the execution phase." Loop me in. That phrase was a trapdoor. You do not loop someone in when they built the house. You only loop them in when you need someone to clean the toilets after the party. I did not yell at Logan. It would have been like yelling at a screwdriver for turning a screw. He was just a tool. I nodded slowly, turned around, and walked back to my cubicle. I sat down and logged into the document management server. I needed to see how deep this rot went. I navigated to the shared repository where we kept the operational playbooks. These were the instruction manuals for the company, the step-by-step guides on how to keep the servers from melting down. I had written 90% of them. I right-clicked on the Master Disaster Recovery Protocol and selected Version History. The list populated on my screen. Current version 5.0. Modified yesterday at 6:45 in the evening by Grant Halverson. I opened the comparison tool to see what he had changed. He had not changed the code. He had not changed the technical steps. He had changed the language. Where I had written execute SQL script to purge cache, Grant had changed it to initiate rapid data cleansing sequence. Where I had written check server load balance manually, he had changed it to leverage synergetic load distribution. He was buzzwordifying my technical manuals. He was taking precise, engineering language and drowning it in corporate speak. It was vandalism. But as I scrolled down, I saw the real purpose. In the original document, every section ended with a contact line for issues. Contact A, Coleman, XT 4402. In Grant's version, those lines were gone. In their place was a generic footer directed by Office of VP Operations. He was erasing me. He was systematically going through every digital asset I had created over the last decade and scrubbing my fingerprints off the glass. He was preparing the narrative that the system ran itself, guided by his brilliant strategy, and that I was just a legacy cost center that could be streamlined away. I closed the file. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. A younger version of me might have stormed into his office. A younger version of me might have sent a furious email to HR, but I knew better. HR was not there to protect me. HR was there to protect the company. And right now, Grant Halverson was the company's new favorite toy. If I fought him now, I would look like a bitter, resistant employee who refused to get with the new program. He would frame it as a culture clash. He would say I was unwilling to adapt to the new unified voice. No, I needed something better than anger. I needed proof. I opened a new application on my second monitor. It was a simple screen recording software, the kind quality assurance testers use to log bugs. I set it to record my screen, my keystrokes, and the system timestamps. Then I opened the folder where I kept my raw work files. I started creating a log, not a diary, but a forensic evidence chain. Item 1. Date October 12th. Document Disaster Recovery Protocol. Action User G. Halverson removed technical attribution and replaced operational directives with non-standard terminology. Impact ambiguity in emergency response instructions. Item 2. Date October 14th. Personnel. Logan Pierce. Action assumed authorship of variance matrix. Instructions cited verbal command from G. Halverson regarding unified voice. I typed steadily. I detailed every meeting invite that overlapped with my critical maintenance windows. I documented every email where Grant asked me to just send him the raw numbers so he could massage them. I saved copies of the original files and placed them side by side with the bastardized versions he had uploaded. I was building a museum of their fraud. At 5 o'clock, Grant walked by my desk. He had his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, a casual affectation that was meant to look effortless. Heading out. "Allison," he asked. "Remember, we have that culture brainstorming session tomorrow at 8. I really want your input on how we can boost energy in the engineering pod." I looked up at him. The reflection of my monitors danced in his polished eyes. "I will be there. Grant," I said. "I am just finishing up some documentation." "Great," he said, pointing a finger at me like a pistol. "Love the dedication. Keep pushing the needle." He walked away, whistling. He thought he was watching a subdued employee finishing her chores. He had no idea he was watching the court stenographer typing out his indictment. I turned back to my screen. I had one more folder to check. It was the vendor payment trigger log. I had seen a flicker of activity there earlier in the day. Something that did not look like a buzzword edit. It looked like a rerouting. I opened the script. The logic had been touched. Someone had added a conditional loop that bypassed the standard approval gate for invoices under $5,000. Grant was not just stealing credit, he was loosening the locks. I took a screenshot. I added it to the dossier. The sun was setting outside, casting long orange shadows across the office floor. The cleaning crew would be arriving soon. I was usually the only one left by then. I saved the file to an encrypted partition on my hard drive. I named it something dull, old system configs. Then I packed up my bag. As I walked to the elevator, I passed Logan's desk. He had left his computer on, the screensaver bouncing a generic company logo around the black void. A sticky note was attached to his monitor. It was in Grant's handwriting. "Good work on the matrix. Next step, payroll automation. Let us see if we can trim the fat." I stared at the note. Payroll. They were coming for the money next, and they were going to use the boy who didn't know a join from a union to do it. I pressed the elevator button. The doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped in and watched the fourth floor disappear as the doors slid shut. They thought they were streamlining the operation. They thought they were trimming the fat. They did not realize that the fat was the insulation on the wires, and they were about to expose the live current to the open air. You know the feeling you get right before a thunderstorm breaks. The air pressure drops so low that your ears pop, and the static electricity makes the hair on your arms stand up. The sky turns a bruised shade of purple, and the birds stop singing. That is exactly what the office felt like on Wednesday. It was not something you could point to on a graph. It was a vibration in the floorboards. It was the way conversations died the second I walked into the break room to refill my water bottle. 2 weeks ago, Melissa from Human Resources would have stopped me to ask about my weekend or compliment my earrings. Today, she saw me coming down the hall, and she suddenly became very interested in the lint on her skirt. She turned her body away from me, a physical shield, and tapped furiously on her phone. I said hello to her. "Hi, Melissa," I said. She jumped. It was a small, guilty twitch. "Oh, hi Allison. Busy day. Super busy." She did not look me in the eye. She scuttled away toward the elevator bank like a crab seeking shelter. Then there were the emails, or rather, the lack of them. Usually, My inbox is a relentless stream of ticket notifications, deployment requests, and questions from junior developers who broke the testing environment. But that Wednesday morning, the flow had turned into a trickle. I was being omitted from threads I had started. I would see a reply come in where someone had accidentally left me on the copy line, only to see the next reply remove me again. They were having conversations about my systems in a room where I had been locked out. And then there was Grant. Grant Halverson, the man who preached about transparency and open doors, walked past my cubicle 3 times that morning. Every single time, he was looking at his phone, or looking at the ceiling, or looking at the far wall. He walked with a stiff, deliberate gait, like a man carrying a tray of full champagne glasses across a slippery floor. He was afraid to look at me. He knew what was coming, and he did not have the stomach to face the person he was about to execute. I did not ask him what was wrong. I did not chase him down. I sat in my ergonomic chair, adjusted my glasses, and turned my attention to the one thing that never lied to me: the code. I had a script running in the background that monitored our internal code repositories. It was a standard monitoring tool, or at least, that is what I told the security team when I installed it 3 years ago. Its official purpose was to detect accidental deletions. Its actual purpose was to tell me when someone was messing with the architecture. At 10:14 in the morning, the alert flashed on my secondary monitor. A new repository had been created. It was named Project Phoenix Alpha. The name was a cliché. Corporate restructuring projects always had names involving rising from ashes or new horizons. I clicked into the details. The repository was private. My user account did not have read access. That was their first mistake. They assumed that restricting my user account would blind me. They forgot that I was the root admin for the version control system. I did not need permission to see inside a box I had built. I opened a terminal window, bypassed the front-end permissions using a service account credential, and cloned the repository to a sandbox environment on my local machine. I opened the file structure. It was my code, all of it. They had taken the core payroll calculation engine, the vendor triggers I had written to handle the shell companies, and the entire data visualization pipeline. They had forked it, but they had not just copied it, they were repackaging it. I saw a file named main controller, pi. I opened it. The code inside was mine, identical to the character, except for the comments. My detailed, explanatory comments about why a certain loop was necessary, or why a variable had to be cast as a float had been deleted. In their place were generic, buzzword-heavy descriptions, where I had written, handle edge case for leap year payroll. The new comment read, optimize temporal fiscal alignment. It was plagiarism, pure and simple. But then I saw the pipeline configuration. They were setting up a new deployment path. This code was not meant to run alongside my system. It was meant to replace it. They were building a parallel infrastructure, a shiny new skin to put over my engine, so they could flip a switch and claim they had built a modern system from scratch. I felt a cold nausea settle in my stomach. It was the feeling of violation. It is one thing to be fired. It is another thing to be harvested. I needed to know the timeline. I checked the commit history. The first commit was made 2 days after Grant started. The author of the commit was Logan Pierce. Poor Logan. He was committing code he did not understand. I could see where he had tried to modify a variable name to match Grant's new naming convention and had broken 3 dependencies in the process. He had commented out the error handlers just to get the build to pass. I closed the terminal. I had seen enough. I needed a coffee. Not because I was thirsty, but because I needed to walk around the office and verify the physical reality of what I was seeing in the digital world. I walked to the kitchenette on the east side of the floor. This was where the finance team usually gathered to gossip. The finance department at Northbridge Meridian Systems was leaky. They knew who was getting a bonus and who was getting a pink slip weeks before the paperwork was signed. Gary from Accounts Payable was there, stirring sugar into a mug that said, "World's okayest golfer." He was talking to a junior analyst in a hushed tone. When I walked in, they both stopped talking immediately. The silence hung in the air, heavy and wet. "Morning, Gary," I said. "Hey, Allison," Gary said. His voice was too loud. "Just grabbing some caffeine. You know how it is. End of the quarter coming up. Crunch time. Yeah, I said. Crunch time. I poured my coffee. I could feel Gary's eyes on my back. I took a slow sip and turned around. So, I asked, keeping my tone casual. Any big changes coming down the pipe for the new fiscal year? Gary turned a shade of pink that clashed with his blue shirt. Oh, just the usual. Realignments. Grant is shaking things up. He looked at the junior analyst, then back at me. He could not help himself. Gary was a man who possessed secrets, like a child possesses a frantic bird. He had to let it go or it would hurt him. I saw the new org chart draft this morning, Gary whispered. Oh, I said, yeah, he said, lowering his voice even further. It is weird. Allison, they have Logan listed as the technical lead for data strategy, and underneath him, well, it is all empty boxes. TBD hires. And where am I asked. Gary looked at his shoes. He swirled his coffee. I did not see your name. Allison. Maybe it is just a draft. You know how these things are. Probably just a mistake. Right, I said. A mistake. I walked back to my desk. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. Most people, upon confirming that they were about to be fired and replaced by an incompetent junior employee, would probably storm into the boss's office. They would demand answers. They would cry. They would make a scene. But I did not make a sound. My silence was a weapon. It made them complacent. If I had screamed, they would have locked me out immediately. They would have called security. They would have severed my access before I could do anything. But because I was quiet, because I was the diligent, invisible Allison who always kept her head down, they assumed I was oblivious. They assumed I was just a cog that would keep spinning until they decided to remove it. They forgot that the cog is the only thing that touches the teeth of the gear. I sat down and unlocked my workstation. I closed my email. I closed the ticket queue. I thought back to a conversation I had 5 years ago with the previous CTO. He was a brilliant, paranoid old man named Robert. He had hired me. We were drinking whiskey in his office late one night after we had successfully migrated the database from an on-premise server to the cloud. Robert had looked at me with glassy eyes and asked a question that stuck with me. Allison, he said, you are the only one who knows where all the bodies are buried in this code. What happens if you get hit by a bus tomorrow? What happens if you disappear? I had thought about it for a moment. Then I told him, if I disappear, the system will keep running. Robert, but it won't know why it is running. He had laughed. That is not good enough, he said. We need insurance. So I built the insurance. He called it the bus factor protocol. I called it the black box. It was not a bomb. I am not a vandal. I do not believe in destroying data. Data is sacred. Destroying a company's data because you are angry is a crime, and it is unprofessional. The black box was different. It was a recorder. In aviation, when a plane crashes, the black box tells the investigators exactly what happened. It records every switch flip, every altitude change, every pilot error. It tells the truth when the survivors cannot. I opened my private directory. It was buried deep within a folder of system drivers that no one ever looked at. I double-clicked on the folder named Black Box Protocol. Inside, there was a single executable file and a configuration script. The script was simple. Once activated, it would change the logging level of the entire system from error only to forensic trace. It would record everything. It would record every keystroke made by an administrator. It would record the source IP of every database query. It would verify the MAC address of the machine making the changes. And most importantly, it would map the flow of money. It would track the vendor payments from the moment the trigger was pulled to the moment the funds left the bank account. If Grant and his team were doing what I thought they were doing, fudging the numbers to make the quarter look good before the merger, and routing payments to shell vendors, the black box would catch them in high definition. But it did more than record. It broadcast. I had set up a dead man's switch. If my credentials were removed from the Active Directory, which was the standard procedure when an employee was fired, the black box would not shut down. It would wake up. It would detach itself from the main server process and run as a ghost service. And it would compile its findings into a neat, encrypted package. I hovered my mouse over the executable. The office around me hummed with the banal sounds of corporate life. I heard the printer churning out pages. I heard someone laughing about a television show. I heard Grant's voice booming from the conference room, using words like synergy and leverage. They were planning a party. A party to celebrate the new Northbridge Meridian systems. A party to celebrate the streamlining of operations. A party where my head would be served on a platter. They thought the surprise would be on me. I right-clicked the file. I selected Run as Administrator. A small terminal window popped up. It was black with green text. Initializing protocol. Status dormant. Trigger condition, credential termination. Target output, or 0 p.m. Presentation deck. I typed in the confirmation key. It was the date of my mother's 60th birthday, the one I had missed. Protocol armed. I minimized the window. I looked at the clock. It was 11:30 in the morning. I had 4.5 hours left. I picked up my phone and sent a text to my sister. I might be done with work early today. Do you want to get dinner? Then I put the phone down, adjusted my cardigan, and opened a spreadsheet. If they wanted me to work until the very last second, I would be the most efficient, compliant employee they had ever seen. I would polish the very floor they planned to slip on. The silence in the office was still heavy, but it did not bother me anymore. It felt like the silence of a library, the silence of a place where everything is being written down and nothing is ever forgotten. The invitation arrived at exactly 9:30 in the morning. It was not a request, it was a summons. My Outlook calendar chimed with a single, sharp note, a sound that cut through the low hum of the server fans like a scalpel. I looked at the screen. The subject line was 3 words, HR check-in mandatory. There was no agenda attached. There was no description in the body of the email. There was only a location, Conference Room B. Everyone at Northbridge Meridian Systems knew what Conference Room B was. It was a small, windowless room located conveniently close to the elevators and far away from the main bullpen. It was soundproofed. It had frosted glass panels that blurred the faces of the people inside, turning them into indistinct ghosts. It was the room where they kept the tissues. It was the room where they kept the non-disclosure agreements. It was the room where you went to sign your name on the dotted line and disappear. I did not panic. Panic is a variable that introduces error into the system. I simply locked my workstation. I did not log out. I left my terminal running, the cursor blinking on a blank line, a silent promise that the session was not over, merely suspended. I picked up my phone, checked that it was on silent, and stood up. The walk to Conference Room B was a study in human behavior. The office knew. Offices always know. The grapevine moves faster than fiber optics. As I walked down the main corridor, heads ducked behind monitors, conversations stopped mid-sentence. People suddenly found the pattern of the carpet tiles incredibly fascinating. They were afraid that if they made eye contact with the walking dead, the contagion might spread to them. I reached the door. I paused for a single second, not to compose myself, but to adjust the cuff of my cardigan. Then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air in the room was stale, recycled, and cold. Sitting at the small, round table was Melissa Rourke. Melissa was the Director of Human Resources. She was a woman who had built an entire career on the ability to deliver devastating news with a voice that sounded like she was reading a bedtime story. She wore a pastel blouse and a sympathetic expression that looked like it had been applied with a stencil. Next to her sat Grant Halverson. Grant was leaning back in his chair, his legs crossed, his hands resting on the table. He did not look like an executioner. He looked like a benevolent king who had descended from his throne to mingle with the peasantry. He was smiling. It was a small, tight smile, the kind you give to a child who has just scraped their knee. It was a smile that said he was doing this for my own good. Please, sit down. Allison, Melissa said. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. I sat. I did not pull my chair in. I sat upright, my hands folded in my lap. I looked from Melissa to Grant, then back to Melissa. I waited. Melissa cleared her throat. She opened a thick folder that was sitting in front of her. I could see the edges of the papers inside. They were heavy, high-quality bond paper. They always used the good paper for the termination letters. It was a psychological trick. It made the rejection feel official, weighty, and final. "Allison," Melissa began, and she clasped her hands together on top of the folder. "We have asked you here today to discuss some changes that are happening within the organization. As you know, with Grant coming on board, we have been taking a hard look at our operational structure. We are moving towards a new strategic vision." She paused, waiting for me to nod or say something. I did not. I just watched her mouth move. "We are entering a phase of rapid restructuring," she continued, speeding up slightly. "To achieve our goals for the next fiscal year, we need to be leaner. We need to be more agile. We need to bring in new voices and new perspectives that align with the modernized tech stack we are building." New voices, that was the phrase. It was a polite way of saying cheaper voices. It was a polite way of saying Logan Pierce, who would agree to anything Grant said because he did not know enough to object. Grant leaned forward then. He decided it was time to add his managerial wisdom to the mix. "Allison," he said, his voice deep and smooth, "I want you to know that this is not a reflection on your technical skills. You have done adequate work here. We appreciate the foundation you helped lay in the legacy systems, but the company is evolving. We are pivoting to a cloud-native, synergy-driven approach. We need a team that breathes that culture. We need people who are forward-facing, not stuck in the back-end weeds." He used the word weeds. He was talking about the database architecture that processed $300 million a year. To him, the engine of the company was just weeds. Melissa took over again. She slid the folder across the table toward me. It moved with a soft hiss against the polished wood. "Because your role is being eliminated due to this restructuring, we have prepared a comprehensive separation package for you," she said. "It includes 2 weeks of severance pay, which is quite generous given the circumstances. We are also offering outplacement services to help you update your resume." She tapped the folder with a manicured fingernail. "All we need is for you to sign the release of claims and the non-disparagement agreement. Once that is done, we can process your final check immediately. We want this to be a smooth transition for everyone. We want you to leave here feeling supported." Supported. 2 weeks of pay for 6 years of life. 2 weeks of pay for missing my mother's birthday. 2 weeks of pay for the weekends I spent in the server room while Grant was playing golf. I looked at the folder. It lay there like a dead bird. Most people in this situation would open it. They would read the numbers. They would ask questions. They would bargain. They would ask if they could keep their laptop. They would ask why. They would cry. There was a box of tissues sitting right in the center of the table, ready for the tears. I did not reach for the folder. I did not reach for the tissues. I looked up and locked eyes with Grant. The room was silent. The air conditioning vent above us rattled slightly, a rhythmic clicking sound that marked the passing seconds. Grant's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He was expecting a reaction. He was expecting the emotional outburst that would validate his decision. He wanted me to be messy so he could feel clean. I kept my face completely neutral. I stripped every ounce of emotion from my expression until I was nothing but a mirror reflecting his own hollow ambition back at him. I spoke. My voice was low, steady, and devoid of any tremor. "I am not going to sign that," I said. Melissa blinked. "Allison, I understand this is difficult," but I cut her off with a small motion of my hand. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Grant. "I do not need your severance, Grant, and I do not need your outplacement services." Grant leaned back, his smile returning, though it looked brittle now. "Come on, Allison, do not be difficult. This is a standard procedure. We are trying to help you. Take the package. It is the best you're going to get." I studied him. I looked at the expensive watch on his wrist. I looked at the confident set of his shoulders. He really thought he had won. He thought this meeting was the period at the end of the sentence. He did not realize it was just the comma. I leaned forward. "Just an inch. Remind the board," I said, enunciating every syllable with precision. 4 o'clock this afternoon, the quarterly performance review." Grant frowned. his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What, you are not attending the review? Allison, your employment terminates effective immediately. You will be escorted out of the building." I ignored him. I continued as if reading from a script. "Tell them that at 4 o'clock, the presentation will be very transparent." I let the word transparent hang in the air. I let it sit there between us. Grant froze. The smile did not just fade. It fractured. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch appeared under his left eye. He knew that word. He used that word constantly. But he heard the way I said it. He heard the weight behind it. For the first time since he walked into the company, Grant Halverson looked unsure. He looked at the folder, then back at me, trying to calculate the variables, trying to figure out if I was bluffing. But he could not read me. He could not read me because he had never bothered to learn the language I spoke. I stood up. I reached down to my waist and unclipped my access badge. It was a simple piece of plastic with my photo on it, a photo taken 6 years ago, when I was younger, more hopeful, and less dangerous. I held it over the center of the table. I dropped it. It hit the wooden surface with a sharp clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the small room. It spun for a moment and then settled, face up, staring at the ceiling. That was my resignation letter. That was my signature. I did not say goodbye. I did not look at Melissa, who was gaping at me with her mouth slightly open. I did not look at Grant again. I turned on my heel and walked to the door. I opened it and stepped out into the hallway. Grant called after me. His voice was sharper now, stripped of the fake kindness. "Allison, wait, what did you mean by that?" I did not stop. I did not slow down. I did not look back. I walked straight to the elevators. I pressed the down button. The doors opened immediately, as if the building itself was exhaling me. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the 4th floor for the last time, I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt light. I checked my watch. It was 9:45. The countdown had begun. I walked out of the revolving doors of Northbridge Meridian Systems and felt the humid air of Charlotte hit my face. Most people who have just been fired go home. They go to their cars, they call their significant others, and they drive to the suburbs to fall apart in the privacy of their living rooms. They drink wine. They update their resumes in a panic. They grieve. I did not go home. I crossed the street. Directly opposite our office tower was a small, independent coffee shop called The Drip. It was the kind of place that roasted its own beans and played obscure indie folk music that sounded like whispering. It was also the only place within a 2-block radius that had a direct line of sight to the executive conference room on the 4th floor. I ordered a black coffee. I paid with cash. I did not want a digital trail on my personal card linking me to this location at this specific time, although that was perhaps a bit paranoid. I took a table in the back corner, facing the window. From here, the Northbridge building looked like a giant, glass tombstone. I opened my bag and took out my personal laptop. It was a matte black machine, heavy and unlovely, built for processing power rather than aesthetics. I did not connect to the coffee shop Wi-Fi. Public networks are dirty. Instead, I tethered the laptop to my phone's secure hotspot. I created my own tunnel. I cracked my knuckles. It was 10:15 in the morning. I was technically unemployed. My corporate access badge was sitting on a table in conference room B. My company email was likely already disabled. My Slack account was probably deactivated, marked with that gray tombstone icon that tells your colleagues you have been purged. The IT department, led by a well-meaning but slow man named Kevin, would be running the standard termination script right now. That script would revoke my Active Directory credentials. It would kill my VPN access. It would wipe my keycard. But Kevin was running the script that I wrote 3 years ago, and I knew exactly what that script did not touch. When I built the system architecture for Northbridge, I included a failsafe. We called it the Legacy Portal. It was a maintenance gateway designed for catastrophic failure scenarios. If the main authentication server went down, or if the cloud provider suffered a regional outage, The legacy portal was the hardline wire that would let a senior engineer get in to reboot the core. It did not use the standard Active Directory. It used a local authentication table stored on the metal of the server itself. It was not a backdoor. A backdoor is a secret hole left by a hacker. This was the front door key under the mat, and I was the only one who remembered where the mat was. I typed the IP address directly into my terminal. It was a string of numbers I had memorized like my own social security number. The prompt blinked green. Login, I typed sysadmin prime. Password. I typed a string of 30 characters that included lyrics from a song I liked in college, mixed with the coordinates of my childhood home. The screen paused. My heart did a single, heavy thud against my ribs. If they had found this, if Grant had actually done a proper audit instead of just talking about streamlining, I would be locked out. Access granted. Welcome, admin. I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. I was in. I was now inside the nervous system of the company that had just rejected me. I could see everything. I could see the server load spiking as the morning rush hit. I could see the payroll batch processing in the background. I could see the email traffic flowing through the Exchange server. I could have burned it all down. I could have typed drop table users and erased every employee account in the system. I could have encrypted the customer database and thrown away the key. I could have shut down the cooling fans in the server room and watched the hardware melt. But I am a builder, not an arsonist. Revenge is not about destruction. Revenge is about correction. I navigated to the directory that held the presentation files for the quarterly review. This was the deck that Grant and his team had been polishing for weeks. It was the deck that Logan Pierce had stolen from me. I found the file. Q3, Strategic Review Final V2. PPTX. I did not delete it. If I deleted it, they would just scramble to find a backup. They would apologize for the technical difficulty, delay the meeting by 10 minutes, and Grant would charm his way through it with a whiteboard. No. I needed the deck to load. I needed them to feel safe. I initiated a command sequence I had prepared months ago, part of my black box protocol. I called it Forensic Render Mode. Usually, a presentation deck is a static thing. It is a series of pictures, but the system I built was dynamic. The charts in our decks were live. They pulled data from the database in real time so that the executives always had the freshest numbers. I opened the configuration file for the deck's data source. Currently, it was pointing to Table Financials Adjusted. This was the table where Grant and his team had manually entered their optimistic numbers. I deleted that pointer. I replaced it with a new command, Source System Audit Log. I added a filter, Display Real-Time Trace. Now, when they opened that deck at 4 o'clock, the slides would not show the pretty bar graphs they had prepared. The system would try to render the data, but because I had changed the source to the raw log file, it would display exactly what the system was doing at that very second. It would show the truth, but I was not done. I needed to make sure they hung themselves before the meeting even started. I needed proof of intent. I navigated to the folders that I knew Grant frequented. He had a habit of snooping around in directories he did not understand, looking for things he could claim as his own discoveries. I created 3 new files. I named the first one Executive Comp Bonus Structure Draft, XLS. I named the second one Acquisition Target List Confidential, PDF. I named the third one Layoff Strategy Phase 2.doc. These were honey tokens. They looked like legitimate files. They had realistic file sizes and realistic creation dates, but inside, they were empty of content. Instead, they contained a pixel tag. If anyone opened these files, the system would immediately log a critical alert. It would record the user ID, the time, the IP address, and the machine ID. It would verify that the person opening the file had no business opening it. I placed them in the root directory of the shared executive drive. It was like leaving a plate of cookies out for a greedy child. I knew Grant. I knew his vanity. He would not be able to resist a file named Bonus Structure. I sat back and took a sip of my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The caffeine was sharpening my focus to a razor edge. I decided to take one last look at the data they were trying to present. I wanted to understand the scope of their lie. I knew they were stealing credit, but I wanted to see the numbers they were claiming. I pulled up the table financials adjusted that I had just disconnected. I compared it to the raw transactional data in the table financials actual. I frowned. I adjusted my glasses and leaned closer to the screen. This was not just rounding up. This was not just optimistic projection. The revenue column for September showed $3 million in completed sales. I queried the actual sales database. The real number for September was 1.2 million. Where did the extra 1.8 million come from? I traced the transaction IDs. They were linked to a series of invoices labeled consulting services and advance retainers. I looked at the customer names attached to these invoices. They were generic names: Global Tech Solutions, Meridian Partners LLC, Vanguard Holdings. I ran a quick check on the vendor creation logs. All of these customers had been created in the system within the last 10 days. They had all been created by a user with administrator privileges. The user was Logan Pierce, but Logan did not know how to bypass the credit check validation. Someone had given him the override codes. I looked at the timestamps. These fake invoices were generated at 11 o'clock at night. They were entered into the system, marked as paid immediately, and the revenue was recognized instantly, but there was no money. I checked the bank API connection. The corporate bank account had not received $1.8 million. They were booking fake revenue. They were inflating the company's earnings by nearly 200% for the quarter. Why? Then it hit me. The rumors about the merger. The whispers I had heard in the elevator about a larger tech conglomerate looking to acquire Northbridge. Grant was not just trying to look good for a bonus. He was pumping the valuation of the company. He was fabricating growth so that when the acquisition happened, the stock price would be inflated, and his stock options would be worth a fortune. This was not just office politics. This was securities fraud. This was a federal crime. I felt a chill go down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I had thought I was just exposing a bad boss who stole my slides. I realized now that I was sitting on a nuclear bomb. If this presentation went ahead, if they presented these numbers to the board and the potential investors, the fraud would be official. Once they showed those slides, they were committed. I looked at the time. It was now 12 o'clock. I had 4 hours. I needed to make sure the evidence was airtight. I needed to link Grant to the fake invoices. Logan was the fingers, but Grant was the brain. I dove back into the logs. I looked for the authorization trail. Every time an override code is used, the system records which terminal requested it. I found the request for the credit check bypass. It came from a machine with the MAC address ending in 8F2A. I ran a query to identify the machine. Device owner: Grant Halverson, location VP office. Got you. He had used his own computer to generate the override codes, then walked over to Logan's desk and had the kid type in the data. He thought he was being clever by using Logan's account for the entry, but he forgot that the permission grant itself left a footprint. I exported the log. I exported the fake invoice list. I exported the bank reconciliation report showing the missing cash. I bundled it all into a single encrypted packet. I sat there in the coffee shop, surrounded by people chatting about their weekends and their lattes, and I realized I was holding the smoking gun of a multi-million-dollar felony. The waitress walked by and asked if I wanted a refill. Yes, I said. I think I'm going to be here for a while. I looked out the window at the 4th floor. I could see movement in the conference room. They were setting up. I could see the silhouette of Grant Halverson pacing back and forth. He looked confident. He looked like a man who owned the world. He had no idea that across the street, in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt caramel, the girl he had fired that morning was currently rewriting his destiny. I turned back to my screen. The trap was set. The honey tokens were in place. The deck was wired to explode with the truth. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to walk onto the stage. At 12:07 in the afternoon, the silence of the Northbridge Meridian Systems network shattered. It did not break with a loud noise that you could hear in the hallway. It broke with a digital scream that only I could hear from my table at the coffee shop across the street. I was watching the server request logs scroll down my screen. For the last 2 hours, they had been green and steady. a rhythmic heartbeat of a company functioning normally. But at 12:07, the text turned red. It started with a single failed dependency, then 10, then 300. I opened the intercepted Slack stream in a side window. I had not lost access to the internal chat, because the chat server authenticated against the legacy protocol I had built to ensure communication during outages. They had revoked my official email, but they had forgotten to revoke the shadow admin account that the chatbot used to archive messages. I was reading their panic in real time. The general channel was the first to light up. Sales lead. Sarah wrote, "Is the dashboard down for anyone else? I'm trying to pull the Q4 numbers for a client call, and I am getting a spinning wheel of death." 2 seconds later, a product manager replied, "Same here. My budget tracker is completely blank. It looks like a snowstorm." Then the finance team joined the chorus. Financial analyst Mark typed, "Hey AT, the payroll bridge is throwing a critical error. It says access denied." I thought we had the new permissions set up. I took a sip of my cold coffee and smiled. They did have the new permissions set up, but the new permissions were built on top of the old foundation, and I had just pulled the rebar out of the concrete. Inside the building, I knew exactly what was happening. I could picture the scene on the 4th floor as if I were hovering near the ceiling. The IT department would be scrambling. They would be rolling their chairs across the carpet, shouting error codes at each other. They called it the war room. Whenever a major system failed, they would commandeer the small glass meeting room next to the server closet, cover the walls in sticky notes, and talk in a language that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. Kevin, the current IT manager, was a nice man who thought rebooting a server was the solution to world hunger. I saw his message pop up in the engineering channel. Kevin typed, "All hands on deck. We have a cascading failure in the visualization layer. It looks like a login loop. Everyone check your nodes." Logan Pierce, the newly minted strategy lead, chimed in. His message was frantic. "Guys, the presentation deck is linked to the live dashboard. If the dashboard is down, the slides are blank. We have the walkthrough with Grant in 3 hours. Fix this." I watched the logs. I saw Logan trying to refresh the deck over and over again. Each time he hit refresh, the system logged a failed authentication attempt. He was panic clicking. It was the digital equivalent of slamming a vending machine that ate your dollar. Grant Halverson finally entered the chat. His username appeared with the little crown icon he had insisted on adding to his profile. Grant wrote, "Why am I hearing that my monitors are blank? This is a simple display issue. Let us not overcomplicate it. Just get the plumbing working, people. We do not need a post-mortem. We need a fix." He was dismissing a catastrophic architectural failure as a plumbing issue. To Grant, technology was just magic that happened behind the walls. If the light did not turn on, you yelled at the electrician. He did not understand that the wiring itself had decided to reject him. I switched my view back to the system terminal. I could see the IT team trying to trace the error. They were running trace routes. They were digging into the stack trace. They were getting closer to the source. At 12:20, a senior engineer named David typed into the war room channel I found the block. "All the data requests are being routed through a validation gate in the legacy layer. It is rejecting the new security tokens," Kevin replied. "Can we bypass it?" David wrote negative. "It is hard-coded into the schema. It looks like a master dependency. Wait, I am looking at the credential that owns this process." There was a long pause in the chat. I held my breath. This was the moment of discovery. David typed again. "This credential is ancient. It is time-stamped 6 years ago. It is older than the merger. Who is sysroot alpha?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. That credential was the first user account ever created on the system. I had created it on my first day, sitting on a folding chair in an empty office before Northbridge was even Northbridge. It was the bedrock. Kevin wrote, "I do not recognize it. Is it a vendor account?" David replied, "It has root privileges. It is locking down the entire financial schema. It is demanding a handshake that our current keys do not have." Grant interrupted the technical discussion. His message was in all capital letters. Grant wrote, "I do not care who created it. Reset it. We have a business to run. override the permissions and give Logan access. I saw the command come through the logs a moment later. Kevin had initiated a forced password reset on the sysroot alpha account. He was trying to use the standard administrative toolkit to break the lock. I watched the terminal. Command reset password, acting on user sysroot alpha. Initiator admin Kevin, processing. I tapped my finger on the table. 1, 2, 3, error target user resides in protected legacy partition, write access denied, hierarchy violation. The system spat the command back out. You cannot reset a god with a mortal's tools. The reset command they were using only applied to the Active Directory layer, the modern layer. The account they were trying to change lived in the deep code, the place where the rules of the universe were written. Kevin typed back into Slack, "It is not working. Grant, the system is ignoring the reset command. It is like the account is ghosted. It exists, but we cannot touch it." Grant's reply was instant. Then delete it. Purge the account. David wrote, "If we delete a root dependency, we might orphan the entire database. We could lose the historicals." Grant wrote, "I said delete it. We will rebuild the history later. I need those slides to work by 4 o'clock. Do it." I shook my head. He was willing to lobotomize the company's memory just to save his presentation. It was reckless. It was stupid. And it was exactly what I expected. I saw the delete command come through. Command delete user, acting on user sys root alpha. The system laughed at them. Error, critical dependency. Cannot delete owner of active schema. Archive required before deletion. They were trapped in a loop of their own ignorance. They could not reset it because they did not have the rights. They could not delete it because the system protected its own structural integrity. They were banging their fists against a steel door that I had welded shut. I typed a small command into my own terminal. I wanted to send them a little message. Not a text message, but a system message. A ping. I sent a status update to the admin console they were all staring at. On their screens, inside that sweaty, frantic war room. A notification box would pop up. It would not be a standard Windows error. It would be a raw text alert from the kernel. System alert. Override attempt failed. Unauthorized modification detected. Incident logged. I saw the reaction in the chat immediately. Kevin typed, "Did you see that? It says incident logged." Logan wrote, "Logged where? Who is logging it?" Grant wrote, "Stop looking at the error messages and find a workaround. Route the data around the legacy block. Build a new bridge." David replied. Grant, "That will take days. We have 3 hours." Grant wrote, "Then you better start typing fast." I leaned back in my chair. The tension in the chat was palpable. I could feel the heat radiating off their keyboards. They were exhausted, confused, and terrified. They were realizing that the shiny new dashboard they had built was just a facade, and the thing underneath it had woken up and decided it did not like them. I checked the time. 12:35. The first skirmish was over. The system had held its ground. They were now desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Desperate people try to force things. I saw a new log entry appear. It was from Grant's workstation. He was opening the shared drive. He was navigating away from the technical folders. He was looking for something easier to understand. He was looking for the files I had planted. He clicked on the folder named Executive Docs. He saw the file Executive Comp Bonus Structure Ma Draft, XLS, my honey token. I saw the cursor hover. I saw the double click in the log stream. File Access Executive Comp Bonus Structure Draft, XLS, User Grant Halverson. Status opened, trigger beacon activated. I smiled. He had just tagged himself. He was looking for his bonus, but he had just signed his confession. Slack was still scrolling with panic, but the tone had changed. It was no longer just technical frustration. It was fear. They knew something was wrong with the house. They just did not know that the architect was watching them from across the street, drinking bad coffee and waiting for the grand finale. Panic is a sloppy architect. When people are calm, they build structures that make sense. They follow protocols. They ask for permission. But when the clock is ticking and the walls are closing in, people stop building and start breaking. They grab the nearest heavy object and smash it against the glass, hoping to find a way out. Grant Halverson was smashing the glass. It was 1:30 in the afternoon. The war room was failing. The IT team was still running in circles, chasing the ghost of a permission error that I had cemented into the foundation of the server. Grant realized that the technical solution was not coming. He could not fix the dashboard. He could not make the live data look the way he wanted it to look. So he decided to cheat the old-fashioned way. I watched the logs on my screen. A new session initiated from the vice president's terminal. He had stopped trying to fix the live system. Instead, he was accessing the archive. He navigated to a folder named Archived Projections. This was a dusty corner of the server. It was where we kept the old financial models from 3 or 4 years ago. It was a graveyard of spreadsheets that nobody looked at. Grant was going there because he thought it was safe. He thought it was static. His plan was transparently stupid. He wanted to find an old Excel file, strip out the data, paste in his fake numbers, and then present that static file as if it were the live system. He was going to project a screenshot and pretend it was a dashboard. He found a file named Q3 Financial Model Legacy XLSX. He double-clicked it. I took a slow breath. That file was not a spreadsheet. It was a honey token. A honey token is a piece of data that looks like a treasure but acts like a tracking beacon. It sits there, looking valuable and vulnerable, waiting for someone who should not be touching it to touch it. The moment Grant opened that file, the trap snapped shut. The system did not stop him. It did not throw an error message. It opened the file just fine, but underneath the surface, a script executed. It grabbed his MAC address, which is the unique hardware fingerprint of his network card. It grabbed his IP address. It grabbed the exact timestamp, and it took a snapshot of his active session. The log line appeared on my screen in bright, damning text. Honey token triggered, asset legacy model, user G, Halverson, action, write access initiated. He was not just reading it, he was editing it. He was pasting his fabricated numbers into a file that was rigged to record his every keystroke. He was writing his own confession, cell by cell. But then came the twist. I saw a second stream of activity. It was not coming from Grant's computer. It was coming from the executive assistant station outside his office. Paige Morrow. Paige was Grant's executive assistant. She was 24, ambitious, and terrified of him. She was the kind of person who color-coded her calendar and apologized when other people bumped into her. I had always liked Paige. I thought she was a victim of the toxic orbit Grant created. I was wrong. The logs showed Paige accessing the vendor payment queue. This was a restricted area. An assistant should not have right access to the payment queue, but Grant had given her his administrative token. I watched in horror as Paige uploaded a batch file named Expedite Payment List, CSV. She was pushing the payments through manually. She was bypassing the approval chain that the system had locked down. She was using a command line override that Grant must have scribbled on a sticky note for her. She was not a victim. She was an accomplice. I felt a sharp pang of disappointment. I had hoped the rot was contained to one man, but corruption is infectious. Grant had convinced her that this was normal, that this was just how business was done in the big leagues. He had turned a young woman with a bright future into a co-conspirator in wire fraud. The system recorded her actions. It linked her session to Grant's token. It showed exactly who was typing and whose keys were unlocking the doors. This was where my credential decay buffer came into play. When a standard employee is fired, their access dies instantly. It is a binary switch. 1, you are an employee. 0, you are a stranger. But I had written a different rule for high-level terminations, specifically for the accounts that managed the core architecture. I called it the decay buffer. When the IT department revoked my access that morning, they thought they had flipped the switch to 0, but the system I built treated that revocation as a request, not a command. It entered a state of decay, to the outside world. My account looked dead. I could not log into email. I could not open the front door. But on the inside, my permissions were still haunting the machine. My user ID was still attached to the root processes. It was like a ghost that lingers in a house for a few days after death. watching the new owners move the furniture. This buffer allowed me to capture data on actions taken against my old accounts. Grant and Paige were trying to overwrite the modules I had built. They were trying to force their new data into the containers I owned, because my account was in decay. It did not block them. It simply observed them. It treated their overrides as hostile incursions and logged them with forensic detail. I saw Paige force a payment of $50,000 to a vendor called Obsidian Logistics. I frowned. I did not recognize that name. I opened a new query window. I ran a search on Obsidian Logistics in the historical vendor database. Nothing. The vendor had been created 4 days ago. I checked the address listed for the vendor. It was a P.O. box in Delaware. I checked the bank routing number, and then I saw it. The routing number for Obsidian Logistics was linked to a holding account that had a recurring automatic transfer set up. I followed the transfer. The money went from Northbridge to Obsidian Logistics. Then, 24 hours later, a transaction of almost the exact same amount would come back into Northbridge from a company called Strategic Growth Partners. It was a loop. They were taking company money, sending it out to a fake vendor, and then bringing it back in as revenue from a fake customer. It was a round-trip transaction. It is one of the oldest tricks in the book to inflate revenue. You take $10 out of your left pocket, put it in your right pocket, and tell the investors you just made $10. But they were sloppy. The transaction fees were eating away at the capital. They were losing money on every loop, bleeding the company dry just to make the top-line revenue look bigger for the quarterly report. And there was one more detail. A small percentage of every transaction, exactly 5%, was not coming back. It was staying in the Obsidian Logistics account. That was the kickback. That was the skimming. Grant was not just inflating the stock price. He was stealing 5% of the cash flow for himself. I sat back in my chair. The noise of the coffee shop faded away. The clinking of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine became distant white noise. I was looking at a felony. This was not just a fireable offense. This was prison time. I had enough. I had the logs of the code theft. I had the logs of the honey token access. I had the evidence of the credential override. And now, I had the map of the money laundering scheme. It was time to package it. I initiated the silent digest. This was a protocol I had designed for the legal department. In a company this size, you do not send an email to the general counsel saying, "I think the VP is a crook." Emails get deleted. Emails get ignored. The silent digest was a direct injection into the compliance server. It created a locked, read-only folder on the drive of the chief legal officer. It bypassed the email filters. It bypassed the IT administrators. It simply appeared, like a monolith. I started compiling the audit packet. File 1 Forensic Timeline, PDF. This showed every action Grant had taken since he was hired. Time-stamped to the millisecond. File 2, Code Provenance Analysis, PDF. This proved that the work Logan claimed was actually mine, verifying the authorship down to the syntax style. File 3 Unauthorized Access Log Honey Token, CSV. The proof that Grant tried to manipulate archived data. File 4 Financial Loop Diagram, JPG. A visual map of the money going to Obsidian Logistics and coming back, with the 5% skim highlighted in red. I added a cover sheet. It was simple. It contained no emotional language. It contained no accusations. It just listed the facts. Subject Automated Integrity Report. Priority Alpha. Target Operations Division. Flags Fraud. Embezzlement. Intellectual Property Theft. Status Verified. I hovered my mouse over the Execute button. I thought about Paige Morrow. I thought about the way she used to ask me about my weekend. I thought about how she was currently frantically typing in override codes, thinking she was just being a good assistant. She was going to go down with him. She had signed her name to the crime. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then I remembered the way Grant had looked at me in that conference room. I remembered the way he had tossed my 6 years of service aside like a used wrapper. I remembered the look on his face when he told me I needed to smile more. He had built this machine. He had invited Paige into it. I was just turning on the lights. I clicked Execute. The progress bar flashed across the screen. Uploading to compliance server. 20%, 50%, 80%. Upload complete. Receipt confirmed by server ID. Legal secure 01. It was done. The evidence was now sitting on the encrypted drive of the most powerful lawyer in the company. He would not see it immediately. He would see it when he opened his secure dashboard. And he would open his secure dashboard at exactly 4 o'clock, because that was when the board meeting started. And the general counsel always reviewed the liability status right as the meeting began. I checked my watch. It was 3:28 in the afternoon. The trap was not just set. The cage had already fallen. The animal was inside, pacing back and forth, thinking he was still the hunter. I closed the laptop lid halfway. I needed to stretch. I needed to walk. I stood up and gathered my things. I was not going to watch the rest of this from a coffee shop. I had a ticket to the show. I walked out of the coffee shop and crossed the street. The sun was dipping lower, casting the long shadow of the building over the pavement. I walked up to the glass doors of Northbridge Meridian Systems. I did not have a badge. I had left it on the table, but I did not need a badge. I knew that at 3:30, the delivery door on the side of the building would be unlocked for exactly 5 minutes to allow the catering service to bring in the food for the executive meeting. I knew this because I had written the schedule for the security system. I walked around the corner. The delivery truck was just pulling away. The door was clicking shut, but the magnetic lock had a 10-second delay that I had programmed years ago to help a delivery guy who had a bad back. I caught the door just before it latched. I slipped inside. I was back in the building. I was a ghost in the machine, and I was coming to attend my own funeral. But the body in the coffin was not going to be mine. The time was 3:28 in the afternoon. Inside the main executive boardroom on the 4th floor, the stage was set for a play that nobody realized was a tragedy. I was not in the room yet, but I knew exactly what it looked like. I knew the lighting presets because I had programmed the dimmers to soften the harsh fluorescent glare. I knew the temperature was set to exactly 68 degrees because Grant believed that a colder room kept people alert. And I knew that the long mahogany table was currently covered in the debris of corporate desperation masked as high performance. I stood in the service corridor, watching the feed on my phone. I had tapped into the conference room camera 5 minutes ago. It was a wide-angle view, distorting the edges of the room, but the center was crystal clear. They had decorated the room like it was a shrine to their own ego. Every seat at the table had a glossy folder placed with geometric precision in front of it. The folders were navy blue with the Northbridge Meridian Systems logo embossed in silver foil. Inside those folders were 20 pages of lies, printed on heavy cardstock that felt expensive to the touch. Next to every folder was a bottle of spring water, the labels carefully rotated so they faced outward, aligned like little soldiers. It was corporate theater at its finest. It was designed to dazzle the eye so that the brain would stop asking questions. Grant Halverson was standing at the head of the table. He had removed his suit jacket and draped it over the back of his chair. He had rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt to exactly the midpoint of his forearms. It was a calculated look. It was the visual shorthand for a leader who is ready to get his hands dirty. He was pacing back and forth, muttering his opening lines to the empty air. I turned up the volume on my phone. "We are not just shifting the paradigm," Grant whispered to the wall. "We are rewriting the source code of the industry. Agility, synergy, dominance." He paused, checked his reflection in the darkened window, and adjusted his collar. He looked like a man who believed his own press release. He had no idea that the source code he was talking about was currently weaponized against him. At the other end of the table, the audience was beginning to assemble. Darren Voss, the chief financial officer, was already seated. Darren was a man who looked like he had been carved out of a block of granite. He was not looking at the view of the city. He was looking at the glossy handout. He was flipping through the pages with a frown that carved deep lines into his forehead. Darren was the first crack in the facade. He was a numbers guy. He knew what reasonable growth looked like. He knew that logistical software companies did not suddenly triple their revenue in a single quarter without a major acquisition or a miracle. and Darren did not believe in miracles. He looked up as the chief technology officer, a nervous man named Marcus, walked in. "Marcus," Darren said. His voice was a low rumble. "Have you verified these growth metrics?" Marcus looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He was clutching his phone like a lifeline. He was the one who had been frantically calling the IT war room for the last 2 hours. "I am waiting on the final confirmation from the data team," Marcus said. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his movements jerky and anxious. "We had a bit of a dashboard latency issue earlier, but Grant says the numbers are solid." Darren tapped a finger on the page. 150% growth in the service sector, Darren said. "In 3 months? That is statistically improbable." Grant spun around. He had heard the doubt. He flashed that bright, predatory smile. "It is only improbable if you are looking at it through the old lens." "Darren," Grant said. He walked down the length of the table, projecting confidence. "We unlocked a new efficiency layer. We streamlined the vendor pipeline. The revenue is real. The cash is in the bank." Darren did not smile back. He just closed the folder. "We will see," he said. In the corner of the room, sitting in a chair that was slightly pulled back from the main table, was the representative from legal. It was not the general counsel himself, but his deputy, a woman named Elena. She sat in the shadows, silent and still. She had not touched the water. She had not opened the folder. She was just watching. Legal always knows when the wind changes. They are like animals that sense an earthquake before the ground shakes. Elena's presence was quiet, but it was heavy. She was the one who would receive the silent digest I had sent. I wondered if she had checked her secure dashboard yet. Her face gave nothing away. Paige Morrow was hovering near the presentation laptop. She looked pale. The stress of the last 4 hours had drained the color from her face. She was the stage manager for this disaster. She had been the one to push the fake invoices. She had been the one to type in the override codes. Now, she was terrified that the technology would fail her. She reached out a trembling hand to the wireless clicker. Grant nodded at her. "Fire it up. Paige, let us make sure the transition effects are smooth. I want the splash screen up when the chairman walks in." Paige clicked the button. On the massive 80-inch screen at the front of the room, the image flickered. For a heartbeat, the screen went completely black. It was not the black of a turned-off monitor. It was the deep, active black of a terminal command line. A single white cursor blinked in the top left corner. My heart sped up. This was it. This was the system acknowledging the switch. The forensic render mode was engaging. It was shaking off the PowerPoint skin and preparing to show the raw bone. In the room, the tension spiked. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice pitching up. Paige clicked the button again, frantically. "It is just a handshake glitch," she stammered. "It happens when the HDMI cycles." The screen flickered again, and then, mercifully for them, the title slide appeared. Northbridge Meridian Systems Q3, Strategic Overview. It looked normal. It was the slide they expected. The font was correct. The background was the standard corporate blue. Grant let out a breath he had been holding. "See," Grant said, "it is fine. Everything is operational." Paige slumped slightly against the wall. She thought she had fixed it. She thought the glitch was gone. She did not understand that the title slide was just the curtain. Behind that curtain, the actors were being murdered. The system had successfully loaded my alternate data source. The deck was now live. It was now a window into the crime scene. I closed the video feed on my phone. I had seen enough. The stage was set. The actors were in their places. The audience was seated. The only thing missing was the narrator. I stood in the service hallway and smoothed down the front of my cardigan. I picked up the thick folder I had prepared. It contained the hard copies of the audit packet. It was my own prop, heavier and far more dangerous than the glossy brochures inside the boardroom. I walked toward the elevators. This was the executive level. Usually, you needed a special high-security clearance to even get the elevator to stop on this floor. My clearance had been revoked at 9:30 in the morning. According to the employee handbook, I should not be able to be here. I pressed the call button. I did not have a badge. I did not have a key. But I had written the logic for the elevator dispatch controller. when I designed the security integration. I had created a VIP protocol for emergency services. It utilized facial recognition from the security camera inside the elevator lobby to override the card reader in case of a fire or a medical emergency. I had also added my own face to that VIP list. I looked up at the small black dome of the camera in the ceiling corner. I took off my glasses so it could get a clear read of my iris patterns. I waited. 1 second, 2 seconds. The light on the elevator panel turned from red to green. The system chirped a welcoming tone. The heavy steel doors slid open. I stepped inside. The elevator was empty. It smelled of lemon polish and silence. I pressed the button for the 4th floor. Even though I was already there, I wanted the doors to close and open again. I wanted the dramatic entrance. I wanted that brief moment of containment before the explosion. The doors slid shut, enclosing me in the small metal box. I watched the floor indicator light up. I was not Allison Coleman, the fired employee. I was not the quiet girl who fixed the payroll bugs. I was the judgment that they had tried to delete. The elevator dinged. The doors opened. Directly in front of me was the glass wall of the boardroom. The meeting had officially started. The chairman of the board had arrived. I could see his white hair at the far end of the table. Grant was standing up, his arms spread wide, mid-gesture, launching into his opening speech about vision and future. He was facing the board. He was facing away from the door. But Darren Voss was facing me. Darren looked up. He saw the elevator doors open. He saw a woman in a cardigan holding a thick folder, standing there with a calm, terrifying stillness. Darren's eyes widened. He stopped listening to Grant. He just stared at me. Then Paige saw me. Her hand flew to her mouth. She dropped the clicker. It hit the floor with a loud plastic crack. Grant stopped talking. He saw the look on everyone's faces. He saw the distraction. He turned around slowly, annoyed at the interruption. He saw me. I stepped out of the elevator. I walked across the plush carpet of the executive lobby. The sound of my footsteps was swallowed by the floor, but my presence filled the entire space. I did not stop at the reception desk. I did not wait to be announced. I walked straight to the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. I reached out and pushed them open. The air in the room was freezing, just the way Grant liked it. But as I stepped across the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Grant looked at me. His face went through a complex series of contortions, confusion, anger, fear, and then a desperate attempt to regain control. "Allison," he said, his voice tight, "you are not supposed to be here. Security should have—" I walked past him. I did not look at him. I walked to the end of the table, to the empty spot opposite the chairman. I placed my folder on the table. I looked at the chairman. I apologized for the interruption. I said, my voice was steady, clear, and loud enough to reach the back corners of the room. But I believe there has been a mistake in the agenda. Grant moved toward me. "Allison, get out. Now." I turned to the screen. I said, pointing at the massive display where the title slide was waiting. "We should skip the introduction and go straight to the live demonstration." I looked at Paige. "Click it. Paige," I said softly. Paige looked at Grant. She looked at me. She looked at the clicker on the floor. Grant lunged for the laptop to shut it down, but he was too late. The system had already received the signal. The time was 3:59. The forensic render mode had a timer, and the timer just hit 0. The title slide dissolved, and the real show began. The lights in the boardroom dimmed automatically. It was a theatrical feature that Grant Halverson loved. He had insisted on it during his first week, claiming that a darkened room focused the mind on the data. He was right, as the overhead recessed lighting faded to a soft, ambient glow. Every pair of eyes in the room was forced to look at the massive 80-inch screen at the head of the table. Grant was smiling. He was adjusting his cufflinks. He was ready for the applause. Then the screen flickered. It was not the smooth cinematic fade-in of a corporate title slide. It was a harsh, jarring glitch. The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding white for a fraction of a second, causing the chairman to wince and look away. Then, it plunged into total darkness. For 3 seconds, The room was pitch black. The silence was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the sharp intake of breath from Paige Morrow. Then, the text appeared. It was not the sleek, sans-serif font of the marketing department. It was the raw, mono-spaced font of a command terminal. Green text on a black background. It looked like the opening sequence of a bad hacker movie. Except this was real life, and the code was running on the company's main display. Forensic trace session, playback initiated. Grant laughed. It was a nervous, confused sound. "Okay," he said, stepping toward the screen. "Very funny. Marcus, did it push the wrong build? We seem to be in debug mode." Marcus, the CTO, was staring at the screen with his mouth slightly open. He shook his head. "That is not debug mode." Grant. "That is the kernel." The text on the screen began to scroll. At first, it was slow, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Session ID 994 Alpha. Origin Executive Workstation. User Identity. Grant Halverson. Privilege Level Administrator Override. Grant froze. He saw his name. He saw the words, Administrator Override. He turned to look at Paige. "Fix it," he hissed. "Get the slide deck back up. Now." Paige was on her knees, scrambling for the clicker she had dropped. She grabbed it and pressed the forward button frantically. Click, click, click. Nothing happened. The screen did not advance to the next slide. The screen was not listening to the clicker. The screen was listening to me. I stood at the back of the room, near the door, my hands resting on the back of an empty leather chair. I watched the data cascade down the display. The scroll speed increased. Lines of text flew upward, a waterfall of digital evidence. Timestamp, October 14th, 02:13 a.m. Action file. Access. Target Legacy Projection Matrix, XLS. Modification manual entry of cell C4 through C90. The board members were leaning forward now. They were confused, but they were reading. They saw the timestamps. 2 in the morning. They saw the action. Manual entry. Grant lunged for the laptop sitting on the side table. He did not ask Paige to do it this time. He shoved her aside. He hammered his fingers onto the keyboard, hitting the escape key repeatedly. Esc, esc, esc. The screen ignored him. This was not a PowerPoint file running from the laptop's hard drive. This was a live render streaming directly from the server core. The laptop was just a dummy terminal now. He could have thrown it out the window, and the screen on the wall would have kept playing. "Stop this," Grant shouted. His voice cracked. "Marcus, kill the feed, cut the power." Marcus did not move. He was looking at the line of text that had just appeared in bold, flashing letters at the center of the screen. Projection edits executed from VP Ops workstation confirmed match. Darren Voss, the CFO, stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Wait," Darren said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a judge passing a sentence. "Hold on. Grant, stop touching the keyboard." Grant spun around, sweat gleaming on his forehead. "It is a glitch. Darren, the system is corrupted. It is showing garbage data. We need to reboot." Darren pointed a shaking finger at the screen. "That is not garbage data. Grant, that is the raw log. Look at the numbers." The screen shifted. The rolling text vanished, replaced by a split-screen view. On the left side was the slide Grant had intended to show. It showed a bar graph climbing steeply upward, labeled Q3 revenue growth. It was a beautiful, optimistic blue line reaching for the sky. On the right side was the forensic reconstruction of the actual data. It showed the same graph, but this one was flat. It was a jagged, struggling red line that barely cleared the baseline. Between the two graphs, a series of red arrows connected the discrepancies. Next to each arrow was a timestamp and a user ID. User G, Halverson, edit, plus a $400, $1,000. Time, 11:42 p.m. User G, Halverson, edit, $650,000. Time, 11:45 p.m. The room went cold. It was the kind of cold that settles in a morgue. The air felt thin. Grant stared at the screen. The lie was right there, side by side with the truth. There was no nuance. There was no way to explain it away as a rounding error. It was forgery. It was as if someone had projected a video of him breaking into a safe. He looked at the board. The chairman's face had turned a deep, furious red. The other members looked away, unable to watch the public dismemberment of a career. Grant turned to me. His eyes were wild. "You," he whispered. "You did this. You rigged it." I did not answer. I did not have to. The screen answered for me. The display wiped again. The graphs disappeared. A new header appeared. Subject Shell Vendor Analysis. Target Obsidian Logistics. A gasp went through the room. It came from the corner where legal was sitting. Elena, the Deputy General Counsel, had opened her binder. She had been reading the silent digest I had sent her earlier, cross-referencing the papers in her lap with the horror show on the wall. She looked up. Her face was pale, but her eyes were hard. "It matches," she said softly. The room was so quiet that everyone heard her. Grant looked at her. "What matches?" The screen populated with a web diagram. It was the map I had drawn. In the center was the Northbridge corporate account. Radiating out from it were arrows pointing to Obsidian Logistics. Transaction $50,000. Approval VP override. Transaction $75,000. Approval VP override. Then, the arrows curved back. Inbound transaction $47,500. Source Strategic Growth Partners. The loop was visible. It was a circle of fraud, glowing in high-definition neon, and then the kicker. The screen zoomed in on the approval logs for the outgoing payments. Authorization signature, P. Morrow. Device ID, VP Office Terminal 01. Paige let out a sob. She covered her mouth with both hands. She was staring at her own name on the screen, realizing that her blind loyalty had just become documented evidence of embezzlement. Grant backed away from the table. He bumped into the wall. There was nowhere to go. The exit was blocked by the board members who had stood up. Darren Voss walked over to the screen. He stood directly in front of the map of the money laundering. He looked at the 5% gap between the money going out and the money coming in. 5%, Darren said. He turned to Grant. "You were skimming 5%. You risked the entire merger. You risked a federal indictment. For 5%, Grant tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his hands. He looked at the door. He looked at me. I stood perfectly still. My face was a mask, inside. I felt a vibration in my chest, a deep, resonant hum of satisfaction. It was the feeling of a complex equation finally balancing out to zero. The screen flashed one last time, the diagram faded, a final list appeared. It was a list of IP addresses. It was the list of the computers that had been used to access the honey token files I had planted. File Executive Comp Bonus Structure. Access G. Halverson. Status unauthorized. The chairman slammed his hand down on the mahogany table. The sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot. The water bottles rattled. Enough, the chairman roared. Grant flinched. He looked small now. The rolled-up sleeves did not look like he was ready to work. They looked like he was ready to be handcuffed. The chairman turned to Elena. "Is this accurate?" he demanded. "Can we verify this?" Elena stood up. She held up the binder I had sent her. "We received a verified audit packet 30 minutes ago." She said. Her voice was shaking slightly, but she held her ground. "It contains full forensic logs. It tracks the IP addresses, the bank routing numbers, and the code modifications. We have already run a preliminary trace on the bank account for Obsidian Logistics." She looked at Grant. "It is registered to a residential address in Miami," she said. An address listed under the name of Grant Halverson's brother-in-law. The silence that followed that statement was heavy enough to crush bone. Grant closed his eyes. He knew it was over. The brother-in-law detail was sloppy. It was arrogant. It was the mistake of a man who thought nobody was watching. The screen behind him went black. The show was over. The house lights came back up. Harsh and unforgiving, everyone blinked in the sudden brightness. I took a step forward. I walked to the table. I picked up the folder I had placed there earlier. I did not look at Grant. He was a statue of ruin. I looked at Darren Voss. I believe, I said, my voice calm and professional. That concludes the performance review. Darren looked at me. He looked at the badge I was not wearing. He looked at the chaos on the table. Who are you? He asked. He sounded genuinely bewildered. I am the person who kept the lights on, I said, and then I turned to leave. I had one more thing to do. I had to finish the script. The screen behind Grant Halverson flickered one last time. The complex web of money laundering and IP theft dissolved into static, and then the final slide appeared. It was not part of the deck Grant had prepared. It was a single sentence in white courier font against a stark black background, hovering there like an epitaph. This company ran because someone you erased kept the lights on. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a loud crash. The air conditioning hummed, a low and indifferent sound against the sudden vacuum of human noise. The chairman of the board, a man named Sterling who had built his reputation on being unshakable, slowly took off his reading glasses. He looked at the screen. Then he looked at Grant. Then he looked at me. "Explain this," Sterling said. His voice was not loud, but it was heavy. It vibrated in the glass of water sitting on the table. Grant tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but the smooth corporate baritone he had cultivated was gone. In its place was a dry, clicking sound. He looked at the screen, desperate to find a technical glitch he could blame, but the words were unmoving. "It is a hack," Grant stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is a disgruntled employee. She planted this. This is sabotage." I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Grant. I looked directly at Sterling. I walked to the head of the table and placed the thick folder I was carrying onto the polished mahogany surface. It landed with a solid, heavy thud. It was the sound of reality crashing into their theoretical projections. That is not sabotage. "Mr. Chairman," I said, "that is the audit log." I opened the folder. Inside were the hard copies of everything the screen had just displayed. I laid them out like a dealer laying down a royal flush. "Here is the credential chain," I said, placing the first document down. "It shows that at 2:13 in the morning, Grant used his administrator privileges to override the financial safety locks." I placed the second document down. "Here are the honey token activation logs. These prove that he accessed archived data files that had no business being opened, files that I planted specifically to catch unauthorized access." I placed the third document down. It was a printout of a Slack conversation between Grant and Paige Morrow. "And here is the instruction to create the shell vendor." Paige let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She was sitting near the wall, her hands trembling so violently that she had to grip the edge of the table to keep them still. She knew what those logs meant. She knew that simply following orders was not a defense when the orders were felonies. Sterling picked up the papers. He scanned them with eyes that had seen 40 years of corporate contracts. He stopped at the credential log. He frowned. "Ms. Coleman," Sterling said, looking up at me, "you were terminated this morning at 9:30. "Correct," I said. "Then why do these logs show your user permissions being active in the system all day? Why does it show that the final authorization for these changes passed through your legacy protocols?" He was asking the right question. He was asking if I was an accomplice. I took a breath. This was the moment. Because, "Mr. Chairman, I built this system to function like the black box on an airplane." I said. I looked around the room. I made eye contact with Darren Voss, the CFO, who was still staring at the money laundering map on the screen. "When a plane crashes, people lie," I continued. "Pilot error becomes mechanical failure. Weather becomes an act of God. But the black box does not lie. It records the position of every switch. It records the pressure on every lever. And most importantly, it records who was holding the yoke when the nose went down." I pointed at the screen. "When you fired me, you thought you were removing a liability. but my credentials were the structural beams of your database. When Grant tried to cut them out to install his own fraud, the system went into defensive mode. It did not block him. It simply recorded him. It used my ghost permissions to tag every single file he touched. I paused. I did not hack your company, sir. I simply turned on the recorder and let your vice president dictate his own confession. Sterling looked at Grant. The disgust on his face was undisguised. Grant was leaning against the wall now, looking like he was trying to shrink, trying to disappear into the drywall. It was a bridge loan, Grant whispered. We were going to pay it back after the merger. It was just to smooth the numbers. Everyone does it. Darren Voss stood up. Not everyone steals 5% off the top. Grant, Darren said coldly, and not everyone uses a shell company registered to their brother-in-law. Elena from legal closed her binder. The sharp snap of the metal rings echoed in the room. Mr. Chairman, Elena said, her voice crisp and efficient. Based on the evidence provided in the silent digest and confirmed by this display, I am advising an immediate suspension of Grant Halverson pending a criminal investigation. We need to bring in forensic auditors and notify the SEC within the hour. Sterling nodded. Do it, Sterling said. He turned to the security guard standing by the door. The guard had been there to ensure the smooth delivery of lunch, but now he had a different job. Please escort Mr. Halverson out of the building, Sterling said. Take his badge, take his phone, and take his laptop. Grant straightened up, trying to summon one last shred of dignity. You cannot do this. I am the VP of Operations. I have a contract. You have the right to remain silent, Allison said softly, almost to herself. 2 more security officers appeared at the door. They flanked Grant. They did not touch him, but the threat was clear. Grant looked at the table, at the glossy folders he had prepared, at the water bottles with the logos facing out. He looked at the empire he thought he had conquered. Then he looked at me. There was no hate in his eyes anymore, just shock. He still could not understand how the invisible woman had seen everything. He walked out, flanked by the guards. He did not look back. Paige Morrow began to cry in earnest now. Elena walked over to her. Ms. Morrow, Elena said gently but firmly, we need you to come to my office. We have some questions about the override codes. Paige nodded, wiping her eyes, and followed Elena out of the room. The door closed. The room was quiet again. The screen behind me was still projecting the final sentence. This company ran because someone you erased kept the lights on. Sterling cleared his throat. He looked at Darren, then he looked at the empty chair where Grant had been sitting. Then he looked at me. Ms. Coleman, Sterling said. I adjusted my glasses. Yes, sir. We seem to have a problem. Sterling said. He gestured to the screen. You have exposed the fraud. You have saved us from a disastrous merger that would have resulted in federal charges. We appreciate that. He paused, tapping his finger on the mahogany. However, he continued. You have also demonstrated that our entire infrastructure is dependent on legacy code that only you understand, and you have demonstrated that without you, we are effectively flying blind. I waited. I knew what was coming. We would like to rescind your termination, Sterling said. We want to offer you your job back, with a raise, of course, a significant raise. We need you to stabilize the system. I smiled. It was a small, polite smile. No, I said. Sterling blinked. Excuse me, I'm not coming back. I said, you fired me. You let a man like Grant treat me like furniture. You let him erase my name from my own work. That trust is broken, and it cannot be patched. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small USB drive. However, I said, I am a professional, and I do not leave a mess. I placed the drive on the table next to the heavy folder. On this drive is a clean transfer protocol. I said, it contains a full permission map of the system. It contains a runbook that explains every dependency I built over the last 6 years. And it contains a script called the one-click wipe. I pointed to the drive. That script will remove my ghost credentials. It will remove the black box protocol. It will scrub the legacy backdoors I used to maintain the system. It will hand full, unencumbered control of the architecture back to your IT department. Sterling looked at the drive like it was a diamond. But, I added, I am not giving this to you as an employee. I am giving this to you as an external consultant. I looked at Darren Voss. My consulting rate is 3 times my previous hourly salary. I said, the transfer process will take 2 weeks. I will work remotely. I will not attend status meetings. I will not do pulse checks. And I require the full payment for the 2-week contract to be wired to my account by 5 o'clock today. Darren looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at the screen, then at the drive. They had no choice. If I walked out with that drive, their system would remain a haunted house that locked them out of their own money. Agreed, Sterling said immediately. Darren, cut the check. I nodded. I turned to the laptop one last time. I typed a single command. The screen behind me went black. The text vanished. The forensic mode disengaged. The room returned to the soft, harmless glow of a standard corporate meeting. I picked up my bag. I did not shake hands. I did not say goodbye. I walked to the door. Ms. Coleman. Sterling called out just as I reached the handle. I stopped and turned halfway around. Why did you do it? Sterling asked. You could have just let him crash. You could have just walked away this morning and let the company burn. Why did you bother to capture the evidence? I looked at him. I looked at the room full of powerful men who had no idea how the electricity worked. I did not burn the company. I said, I just turned on the lights. I opened the door and walked out into the hallway. The elevator was waiting. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the doors close on Northbridge Meridian Systems for the last time. The descent was smooth. When I walked out of the building, the sun was setting, the air was warm. I checked my phone. A notification from my bank app appeared on the screen. The wire transfer had arrived. I smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. Then I turned my phone off and walked down the street to find a place that sold good champagne. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate justice. I would love to hear from you in the comments section below, so please tell me where you are listening from and if you have ever had a boss like Grant Halverson. If you enjoyed seeing the underdog win, please make sure to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Hit the like button and smash that hype button to help this story reach more people who need a little victory today.